The train pulled into Grand Central Terminal on the morning of November 3, 1912, 47 minutes behind schedule. Among the passengers who disembarked was a man named Douglas Kearney, 31 years old, employed until recently as a surveyor for the Canadian Pacific Railway. He carried no luggage. His coat was borrowed. His boots, according to the station porter who later testified before the inquest, were wrapped in canvas and twine. Kearney walked directly to the Western Union office and sent a single telegram to his sister in Boston. Arrived. Will not be coming home. Douglas. He then disappeared into the city. It would be 6 days before the authorities located him in a rented room above a tailor's shop on Mulberry Street. By then, the newspapers had already begun their work. The New York Times ran the headline on November 8th. Sole survivor of Hudson Bay expedition refuses all comment. The Boston Globe was less restrained. What did he see? Kearney's silence deepens mystery of 7 lost men. When questioned by police, by railway officials, by representatives of the families, Kearney offered nothing. He confirmed his identity. He confirmed he had been part of the surveying expedition that departed Winnipeg on June 12, 1912, bound for the uninhabited coastline near Churchill, Manitoba. He confirmed that he had returned alone. Beyond that, he would say only this: "I cannot speak of it." The phrase appears 14 times in the transcripts, always identical, never elaborated. By November 15th, the inquest had convened. Kearney attended every session. He sat in the second row, hands folded, eyes forward. He answered procedural questions: his age, his employment history, his next of kin. When asked what had become of the other 7 men, he repeated the phrase. When pressed, he stood, walked to the judge's bench and requested that his testimony be sealed for a period of 50 years. The request was unprecedented. The judge, a man named Horace Whitman, noted in his private diary that Kearney's demeanor was neither evasive nor hostile. He did not appear to be concealing guilt. Whitman wrote, he appeared to be concealing grief. The motion was granted. The transcripts were sealed. Kearney left the courthouse and was never seen in New York again. What follows is a reconstruction. It is built from fragments. Letters written before the expedition departed, diary entries kept by men who did not return, testimony given by those who knew them, and the limited public record that survived the sealing order. It is also built from absence, from the 14 sealed documents that remain locked in a vault in Lower Manhattan, inaccessible until 1962, and from the silence of a man who chose, deliberately and at great personal cost, not to speak. This is not a story about what happened. It is a story about what was not said. Douglas Kearney was born in 1881 in Portland, Maine, the second son of a maritime insurance clerk. He attended public school until the age of 16, then apprenticed with a civil engineer named Samuel Hackett, who described him in a letter of reference as methodical, sober, and unnaturally patient. By 1905, Kearney had moved west, taking work with the Canadian Pacific Railway as a junior surveyor. He was promoted twice. His supervisor, a man named George Talbot, wrote in an internal memo that Kearney possessed an unusual capacity for solitude. In the spring of 1912, the railway authorized a survey of a potential northern route that would extend the line toward Hudson Bay. The terrain was unmapped, the climate hostile. The expedition required men who could endure isolation, physical hardship, and the absence of resupply for up to 5 months. Kearney volunteered. He was not the leader. That role belonged to a man named Arthur Penworth, 43, a veteran of Arctic surveys and a decorated member of the Royal Geographical Society. Penworth had published 2 books on northern navigation. His reputation was unimpeachable. The other 5 men were specialists: a cartographer, a geologist, a physician, a cook, and a transport manager. Their names are a matter of record. They will not be repeated here, out of respect for the families who spent decades seeking answers. What matters is this: Kearney was the youngest. He was the least experienced. And when the expedition failed to return by its expected date of October 15, 1912, he was the only one who came back alive. The first public indication of trouble came on October 22nd when the railway's regional office in Winnipeg received a telegraph from a Hudson's Bay Company trading post near Churchill. The message was brief. Party expected September 30th, no sign. Weather worsening. Search parties were dispatched. None found evidence of the expedition. On November 2nd, a trapper named Emil Vasquez reported encountering a man on foot near the Nelson River, approximately 90 miles south of the expedition's last known position. The man was alone. He was walking south. He refused assistance. Vasquez later testified that the man did not seem lost, but that his eyes had the look of someone who had seen the end of something. It was Kearney. By the time Vasquez reported the encounter, Kearney had already crossed into the United States. He had walked, by the best estimates, over 300 miles. He had done so in late autumn, through terrain that claimed experienced hunters. He had done so without supplies, without a map, and, most peculiarly, without seeking help from any of the outposts he must have passed. It was as though he were fleeing. The inquest opened on November 12th in the New York County Courthouse. The families of the missing men were present. So were representatives of the railway, the Canadian government, and the press. Kearney sat alone. The proceedings were formal, methodical. Evidence was presented. The expedition's planned route, its supply manifest, the last confirmed sighting by a survey team working 200 miles to the south. Letters written by the missing men were read aloud. One, penned by Arthur Penworth to his wife, mentioned Kearney by name. Young Douglas is proving himself more capable than his years suggest. He does not complain. He does not waver. I believe he will go far in this profession. When the letter was read, Kearney did not react. He was called to testify on the third day. He took the stand. He confirmed his identity. He confirmed the expedition's purpose. When asked what had happened after June 12th, he said, "I cannot speak of it." The attorney for the families, a man named Reginald Howe, pressed him. "Mr. Kearney, 7 men are missing. Their families deserve to know. I cannot speak of it. Did you witness their deaths? I cannot speak of it. Were you responsible?" Kearney did not flinch. He did not look away. "I cannot speak of it." Howe tried another approach. "Mr. Kearney, if you were not responsible, why will you not?" "I cannot speak of it." The judge intervened. He asked Kearney if there were any circumstances under which he would testify. Kearney stood. He walked to the bench. He spoke quietly. The stenographer could not hear him. The judge nodded. Kearney returned to his seat. Judge Whitman announced that Kearney had requested his testimony be sealed. The courtroom erupted. Howe objected. The families wept. The press surged forward. Kearney sat motionless. The motion was granted. 14 documents were submitted under seal. Kearney's written testimony, his sworn affidavit, and 12 supplementary materials whose contents remain unknown. The judge ordered them locked until November 1962. The inquest concluded the following day. The official finding was inconclusive. Cause of death unknown. Circumstances undetermined. No criminal negligence established. Kearney was not charged. He was not detained. He was free to leave. He left. The expedition's planning began in January 1912. The Canadian Pacific Railway had secured funding for a feasibility study of a northern route that would connect Winnipeg to Churchill, opening access to Hudson Bay and, potentially, to transatlantic shipping routes. The route was speculative, expensive, and politically motivated, but the railway's directors believed it could redefine trade in North America. Arthur Penworth was hired to lead the survey. He assembled his team through the winter and early spring. His journals, recovered from his home after his disappearance, reveal a man who took the work seriously but who also understood its dangers. In an entry dated February 14, 1912, he wrote, "We will be beyond the range of resupply for 16 weeks. If something goes wrong, there will be no rescue. The men I choose must understand this. They must be willing to trust one another completely. Ego and error are equally fatal in such terrain." Penworth's first hire was Dr. Lionel Marsh, a physician who had served in the Yukon during the gold rush. Marsh was 51, a widower, and known for his calm under pressure. In a letter to Penworth he wrote, "I have seen men die in the cold. I have also seen men survive it. The difference is almost always mental." The cartographer was a Frenchman named Philippe Deschamps, 36, who had worked on surveys in the Canadian Rockies. His letters home to his wife in Montreal were cheerful, almost cavalier. "It will be a hard summer," he wrote in May, "but I have been through worse." Besides, Penworth is careful. He does not take unnecessary risks. The geologist was a Scot named Duncan Fairley, 40, who had published extensively on glacial formations. He kept no diary. His family described him as reserved, solitary, and deeply religious. The cook was a man named Otto Brunner, a German immigrant, 28, who had worked in railway camps across Western Canada. He was known for his ability to make meals from almost nothing. One of his former employers described him as mirthful, even in hardship. The transport manager was Samuel Inwood, 33, an experienced outdoorsman who had guided hunting parties through northern Manitoba. He was the expedition's practical anchor, the man who knew how to read weather, how to navigate rivers, how to keep sleds moving through snow. And then there was Kearney. Kearney's hiring was almost incidental. Penworth needed a second surveyor, someone who could assist with measurements and record-keeping. Kearney's supervisor, George Talbot, recommended him. In a letter to Penworth dated March 3, 1912, Talbot wrote, "Douglas is not flashy. He does not lead, but he does not fail. He is the kind of man you forget is there until you need him, and then you realize he's been doing the work all along." Penworth met Kearney once in Winnipeg, in late April. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Penworth's journal contains a single line about it. "Kearney will do." Kearney, for his part, left no record of why he accepted the assignment. His letters to his sister Margaret were infrequent and brief. One, dated May 10, 1912, reads, "I will be away for the summer. Do not worry. I'm good at being alone." Margaret later testified that her brother had always been solitary, but not withdrawn. "He was kind," she said. "He listened, but he did not need people the way most of us do." The expedition departed Winnipeg on June 12, 1912. They traveled by rail to the Pas, then by riverboat to Norway House, and finally overland by sled and foot to the coast. The route was punishing but not unprecedented. Penworth had planned for delays, for weather, for the possibility of injury. What he had not planned for, what no one could have planned for, was whatever happened after they reached the coast. The last confirmed sighting of the full expedition was on August 3, 1912, by a survey crew working near Split Lake, roughly 200 miles south of Churchill. The crew's foreman, a man named Joseph Langley, later testified that the Penworth party was in good spirits. "They were tired," he said, "but no more than you'd expect. They had food, they had equipment. Penworth said they were ahead of schedule." Langley asked if they needed anything. Penworth declined. "We're well provisioned," he said. "We'll see you in October." That was the last anyone saw of them. What happened between August 3rd and November 2nd, between the last sighting and Kearney's solitary appearance near the Nelson River, is the space this reconstruction cannot fill. But before that space, there were men, and they trusted one another. Penworth's journals, recovered from his home, contain entries through July 27th. The final entry reads, "The coast is more beautiful than I expected. The light here does not fade, it lingers. I think we will finish early. The men are in good health. Even young Douglas, who I worried might struggle with the isolation, has proven himself steady. He does not speak much, but he listens. He notices things. Yesterday he corrected an error in my calculations, politely, quietly, without fuss. I am grateful to have him." Dr. Marsh wrote to his sister on July 15th, "The work is hard, but the company is good. Penworth runs a tight ship, but he is fair. Deschamps sings in the evenings badly, which is somehow comforting. Kearney is the quietest of us, but he is watchful. I think he sees more than he says." Philippe Deschamps wrote to his wife on July 22nd, "We are making excellent progress. The maps are coming together beautifully. I think this route is feasible, perhaps even profitable." Penworth believes we will be home by late September. I miss you terribly, but I am glad to be here. This is the kind of work that matters." Duncan Fairley wrote nothing, but his family later reported that he had been in good spirits before he left. His niece, in a letter to the inquest, wrote, "Uncle Duncan was not a warm man, but he was dependable. He believed in duty. He would not have abandoned the others." Otto Brunner's last letter, dated July 18th, was addressed to his mother in Hamburg. "The food is dull, but I am doing my best. The men are kind to me even though my English is poor. Kearney helped me repair the stove yesterday. He did not say much, but his hands were careful. I think he is a good man." Samuel Inwood left no letters, but his wife later testified that he had written to her regularly until mid-July. His last letter said they were all well, she said. He said the work was nearly done. He said he would be home soon. These were the men who disappeared. These were the men Kearney would not speak of. There is no direct evidence of what happened. There are no journals past July. There are no witnesses. There is only inference drawn from the landscape, the season, and the single fact that cannot be ignored. Kearney survived, and they did not. The historian's task, then, is not to reconstruct what happened, but to map the possibilities and to recognize where the evidence stops and speculation begins. The expedition's planned route took them northeast from Split Lake toward the Hudson Bay coast, following river systems and portage trails that had been used by indigenous hunters and trappers for centuries. The terrain was difficult, but navigable in summer. Muskeg, black spruce forests, shallow lakes choked with reeds. The weather, while unpredictable, was not typically lethal in July and August. By early September, conditions would have begun to shift. Temperatures would drop, daylight would shorten, rivers would begin to freeze. But the party was expected to turn south by late August, retracing their route before the worst of the weather set in. They did not turn south, or if they did, something stopped them. The inquest reviewed meteorological records from the summer of 1912. The season was unusually wet, but not catastrophic. There were no reports of floods, no unseasonable storms, no events that would have made travel impossible. The railway's engineers examined the equipment manifest. The party had been provisioned for 20 weeks, with an additional margin for emergencies. They had tents, rifles, fishing gear, medical supplies, and enough dry goods to last through October. If they had simply gotten lost, they should have been able to survive. If they had been injured, Marsh was a trained physician. If they had run out of food, Inwood and Brunner were both skilled in wilderness survival. The logical conclusion, the conclusion the inquest could not escape, was that something had happened that was not environmental, something that the supplies, the skills, and the planning could not mitigate, something human. The most damning evidence, though it was never formally presented, came from a trapper named William Oakes, who worked the trap lines north of Split Lake. Oakes was interviewed informally by a journalist from the Winnipeg Tribune in December 1912, after the inquest had closed. The interview was never published. The notes survived in the journalist's estate and were rediscovered in 1948. Oakes said he had seen signs of a camp near the Owl River in mid-September. "It looked abandoned," he said. "But it wasn't old. The fire pit was still greasy. There were boot prints, and there was something else." The journalist asked, "What?" "A grave," Oakes said. "Unmarked, shallow, recent." The journalist asked if he had reported it. "To who?" Oakes said, "I didn't know anyone was missing yet." By the time the inquest convened, Oakes had moved to Saskatchewan. He was never called to testify. The grave, if it existed, was never located. There is another piece of evidence, less tangible but no less significant. The route Kearney took when he walked out. He did not follow the expedition's planned path. He did not return to Split Lake, where the survey crew could have assisted him. He did not stop at Norway House, where there was a Hudson's Bay post. Instead, he walked south and east, through uninhabited country, crossing the Nelson River, at a point that required wading through freezing water. He avoided settlements. He avoided roads. He walked as though he did not want to be found. Why? The inquest's lead investigator, a man named Charles Morton, noted this in his private files. Morton had served as a detective with the New York Police Department before retiring to work as a railway investigator. He was methodical, skeptical, and deeply frustrated by Kearney's silence. In a memo dated November 20th, 1912, Morton wrote, "Kearney's route makes no sense unless he was running from something. Not from the wilderness, from people. He walked 300 miles to avoid contact. That is not the behavior of a man who has simply survived a tragedy. That is the behavior of a man who does not trust what he might say if questioned too soon." Morton recommended that Kearney be held for further questioning. The recommendation was overruled. Kearney had broken no law. He had committed no crime. He was free to go. Morton resigned 2 months later. There is one final document from this period. A letter written by Kearney to his sister Margaret, dated November 18th, 1912. It is the only letter he wrote after his return. It was included by Margaret's request in the sealed file. The letter has never been made public, but Margaret described its contents in an interview conducted in 1954, 2 years before her death. She said, "Douglas wrote that he was leaving New York. He did not say where he was going. He said he could not come home. He said he was sorry, not for what he had done, but for what he could not undo. He said he hoped I would understand, someday, why he had to stay silent. He said it was the only kindness he had left to give." Margaret never saw her brother again. The sealing of Kearney's testimony did not end the questions. If anything, it intensified them. The families of the missing men were not satisfied. They hired private investigators. They petitioned the courts. They contacted journalists, members of parliament, and church officials. They demanded answers. None came. Reginald Howe, the attorney who had represented the families during the inquest, continued his own investigation for another 3 years. His files, donated to the New York Public Library in 1961, contain hundreds of pages of correspondence, interview notes, and maps. He traveled to Manitoba in the summer of 1913, retracing the expedition's route. He interviewed trappers, traders, and indigenous guides. He found nothing. In a letter to Arthur Penworth's widow, dated September 1913, Howe wrote, "I have exhausted every avenue. I have spoken to everyone who might have seen them. I have searched the country where they vanished. There is no evidence of violence. There is no evidence of accident. There is only absence. And there is Douglas Kearney, who will not speak. I believe he knows what happened. I believe he has chosen not to tell us. I cannot say if that choice is rooted in guilt, in mercy, or in something else entirely." Mrs. Penworth replied, "I do not believe Mr. Kearney is a murderer. My husband was an excellent judge of character. If he trusted Mr. Kearney, then I must trust that judgment, but I also cannot forgive the silence. To know that someone knows and will not tell, it is a cruelty I cannot name." The press, meanwhile, did what the press does. They speculated. They invented. The Chicago Tribune ran a series of articles suggesting that Kearney had gone mad, killed the others in a fit of paranoia, and fled. There was no evidence for this. The articles were later retracted. The Toronto Star suggested that the party had been attacked by a rogue bear, and that Kearney, consumed by guilt, could not bring himself to describe the carnage. Again, no evidence. The Boston Herald took a different approach, suggesting that Kearney had discovered something, gold perhaps, or some other valuable resource, and had killed the others to keep it secret. This theory collapsed when it was revealed that Kearney had returned with nothing, owned nothing, and lived in rented rooms for the rest of his life. By 1915, the story had faded from the newspapers. The families, exhausted and grief-stricken, stopped their public campaigns. The railway moved on. The inquest was filed away. Kearney was forgotten, but not entirely. In 1923, a historian named Eleanor Voss, researching the early surveys of northern Canada, came across the Penworth expedition in the railway's archives. She became fascinated by Kearney's silence. She tracked him down. He was living in Spokane, Washington, working as a night watchman at a lumber mill. He had changed his name to Douglas Kearney. He lived alone. Voss wrote to him requesting an interview. He replied with a single sentence, "I have nothing to say." She wrote again, explaining her research, her intentions, her respect for his privacy. He did not reply. She traveled to Spokane in the spring of 1924. She waited outside the mill for 3 nights. On the 3rd night, Kearney emerged at the end of his shift. Voss approached him. She introduced herself. She asked for 5 minutes of his time. Kearney looked at her. Voss later described his expression as neither hostile nor afraid, but infinitely weary. He said, "You will not find what you are looking for. Please do not come back." He walked away. Voss never saw him again, but she wrote about the encounter in her notes. "I have interviewed hundreds of people in the course of my work. I have spoken to liars, to cowards, to men who could not remember, and men who chose to forget. Douglas Kearney was none of these. He was a man who had made a choice, and who was still living with it. I do not know what happened on that expedition, but I believe Kearney does, and I believe he will never tell." The families never stopped grieving, but they stopped searching. Arthur Penworth's widow, Lillian, moved to England in 1918. She never remarried. In a letter to her sister dated 1920, she wrote, "I used to dream that Arthur would walk through the door. Now I dream that I will simply know what happened. Not why, not how, just what. But even that dream has faded. I think I have accepted that I will die without answers." Dr. Marsh's sister, Caroline, became an advocate for families of missing persons. She lobbied for legislation requiring formal investigations in cases of unexplained disappearance. She testified before Congress in 1927. She never mentioned her brother by name. Philippe Deschamps' wife, Marguerite, returned to France with their 2 children. She burned his letters in 1930. "I could not bear to read them anymore," she told her daughter years later. "They were full of hope." And Kearney? He moved frequently. Spokane, Portland, Sacramento, Tucson. He worked as a watchman, a janitor, a warehouse clerk. He never married. He never owned property. He had no friends as far as anyone could tell. He sent money to his sister, Margaret, every month until her death in 1956. The checks came from different cities, always with the same note: "I am well." In 1958, a social worker in Phoenix encountered an elderly man who had collapsed from heat exhaustion. The man gave his name as Douglas Kearney. He was 77 years old. He had no identification, no family, no fixed address. The social worker arranged for him to be admitted to a charity hospital. Kearney recovered. He stayed for 2 weeks. During that time, he spoke to no one except the nurses, and only to answer medical questions. On the day of his discharge, one of the nurses asked him if there was anyone they should call. He said, "There is no one." She asked if he had ever been married. He said, "No." She asked if he had children. He said, "No." She asked gently if he had anyone at all. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "I did once." He left the hospital and was never seen again. Douglas Kearney died on March 14, 1961, in a boarding house in Flagstaff, Arizona. The death certificate listed his occupation as laborer and his next of kin as unknown. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the city cemetery. The landlord who found him reported that Kearney's room contained almost nothing: a bed, a chair, a change of clothes, and a single book, a copy of the Bible with no inscriptions. There were no letters, no photographs, no personal effects. There was, however, a sealed envelope addressed to the New York County Courthouse. Inside was a handwritten note. "The document sealed in November 1912 may be opened early, if the court sees fit. I will not be alive to object." The note was signed, Douglas Kearney. The envelope was received by the courthouse in April 1961. A clerk reviewed the request. The court determined that the sealing order specified a date, November 1962, and that early release required the consent of all parties. Kearney was dead. The families of the missing men were scattered, many deceased. The motion to unseal was denied. The documents remained locked. In November 1962, 50 years after the inquest, the sealed documents were finally opened. 14 items were removed from the vault. They were catalogued by a county archivist, reviewed by a judge, and released to the public. The contents were as follows: Kearney's sworn affidavit, dated November 14th, 1912. A handwritten account, 12 pages, dated November 13th, 1912. 11 personal letters written by Kearney between November 3rd and November 12th, 1912, and voluntarily submitted to the court. The affidavit and the account were read aloud in open court on November 15th, 1962. By then, every member of the original expedition was long dead. So were most of the families. The courtroom was nearly empty. The contents of the documents were reported in brief by the press, then forgotten. This historian has read those documents. They are now part of the public record, accessible to anyone with the patience to request them from the archives. They do not reveal what happened. They reveal only what Kearney chose to say, and more importantly, what he chose not to say. In his affidavit, Kearney confirmed the following. He was part of the Penworth expedition. The party reached the Hudson Bay coast in late July 1912. The work proceeded as planned through early August. On or around August 10th, 1912, an event occurred. Following this event, Kearney made the decision to leave the party. He walked south alone. He did not return for the others. That is all. The 12-page account is more detailed, but only marginally. Kearney describes the journey north, the terrain, the weather. He describes the personalities of the men, Penworth's calm authority, Marsh's dry humor, Dischamp's songs, Bruner's generosity. He writes with surprising warmth. Then, on page 8, he writes, "On the evening of August 10th, something happened that I cannot describe. Not because I do not remember, but because I do not believe it would serve any purpose to describe it. No explanation I could give would bring comfort. No detail I could provide would answer the questions the families deserve to have answered. I am conscious that this will sound like evasion. It is not. It is an act of care." He continues, "I left the party the following morning. I do not defend this choice. I do not ask for forgiveness. I acted as I believed I must. Whether that belief was correct, I cannot say. I have spent every day since wondering if I should have stayed. I do not have an answer." He concludes, "I cannot tell you what became of the others. I can only tell you that I was not there when it happened. That may make me complicit. It may make me a coward. I have lived with both possibilities. I will die with both possibilities. What I will not do is speak in ways that might cause more harm than silence." The 11 letters are stranger still. They were written to the families of the missing men, 1 to each family, and 4 to Arthur Penworth's widow. Kearney submitted them to the court, but requested they not be delivered. He wrote, "I have written these letters because I needed to say something, even if it could not be said aloud. But I do not believe the families should receive them. To do so would be cruel. I have therefore given them to the court to be sealed with the rest." The letters were read in 1962. They are careful, tender, and deeply apologetic, but they contain no new information. Kearney writes to Lillian Penworth, "Your husband was a good man. He trusted me. I failed him. I do not ask you to forgive me. I ask only that you believe me when I say that I think of him every day, and that I wish I had been strong enough to do what he would have done." To Dr. Marsh's sister, "Your brother was kind to me when he had no reason to be. I remember his voice. I remember his patience. I am sorry I could not bring him home." To Marguerite Deschamps, "Philippe spoke of you constantly. He missed you. He loved you. I wish I could tell you more. I cannot. Please know that he was happy until he was not." The letters are unsigned. Each ends with the same phrase, "I am sorry." After the documents were unsealed, a few journalists attempted to reconstruct the story, but there was nothing new to find. The documents confirmed only what had already been suspected, that Kearney had survived, that the others had not, and that Kearney would not, could not, explain why. One journalist, a woman named Helen Trask, wrote an article for Harper's in 1963. She interviewed the descendants of the missing men. She reviewed the meteorological records, the inquest transcripts, the maps. She concluded, "We will never know what happened on the Hudson Bay coast in August 1912. We know only that 7 men went into the wilderness and 1 came back. We know that the one who came back could have spoken, but chose not to. And we know that 50 years later, when he finally did speak, he still said nothing. This is not the silence of guilt. It is the silence of a man who believed that some truths are too painful to share. This historian agrees. There are theories, of course. There are always theories. Some believe the party was caught in a sudden storm and that Kearney, separated from the others, was unable to find them. But this does not explain why he did not search. It does not explain why he walked away. Some believe there was an accident, a fall, a drowning, a fire, and that Kearney, traumatized, fled. But this does not explain the grave William Oakes claimed to have seen. It does not explain the careful route Kearney took to avoid being found. Some believe there was a conflict, an argument perhaps that escalated into violence, but there is no evidence of this. Kearney was not a violent man. He had no history of aggression. And if he had killed the others, why would the court have sealed his testimony and allowed him to walk free? The most persistent theory, the one that appears in every account of the story, is that Kearney made a choice. That he was faced with a situation in which he could not save everyone, and that he chose to save himself. That he lived with the guilt of that choice for the rest of his life. But even this theory does not explain the silence. If Kearney had simply made a difficult choice under impossible circumstances, why not say so? Why not explain? Why let the families suffer? This historian believes the answer lies not in what Kearney did, but in what he knew. He knew that whatever he said would not bring the men back. He knew that no explanation would comfort the families. He knew that any truth he offered would be dissected, questioned, and ultimately insufficient. And so, he chose silence. Not as an act of cowardice, but as an act of mercy. He believed, perhaps rightly, that not knowing was better than knowing the wrong thing. In 1954, 2 years before her death, Margaret Kearney was interviewed by a graduate student researching the Penworth expedition. The student asked her if she had ever pressed her brother for answers. Margaret said, "Once. In 1920 I wrote to him. I told him I needed to know. Not for anyone else. For me. I needed to understand why he had come back alone." The student asked if he replied. "Yes," Margaret said. He wrote, "You were always kind to me. Please do not ask me to take that kindness away from you." She never asked again. This is what remains. 7 men walked into the wilderness. 1 walked out. He carried their memory, he carried their absence, and he carried until the day he died the weight of what he would not say. The documents are open now. Anyone can read them. But they will find nothing there except the shape of a man who chose, deliberately and at terrible cost, to protect something. What that something was, we will never know. Perhaps it was the families. Perhaps it was the memory of the men he could not save. Perhaps it was himself. Or perhaps, and this is what this historian believes, it was all 3. Kearney did not speak because he knew that the truth, whatever it was, would not set anyone free. It would only bind them more tightly to the loss. And so he chose silence. He chose to carry it alone. He chose, in the only way he could, to be kind. The grave in Flagstaff is unmarked. There is no headstone. There is no record of visitors. But every November, on the anniversary of the inquest, a small bouquet of wildflowers appears. No one knows who leaves them. No one knows if they are for Kearney or for the men he left behind. Perhaps it does not matter. Perhaps the flowers are simply a reminder that some silences are not mysteries to be solved, but boundaries to be respected.